Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this CAFII webinar. My name is Keith Martin, and I am Co-Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Financial Institutions in Insurance, or CAFII. On behalf of myself and my Co-Executive Director colleague, Brendan Wicks, and the CAFII Board of Directors, thank you for joining our webinar today. The Canadian Association of Financial Institutions in Insurance, CAFII, is a not-for-profit association dedicated to the development of an open and flexible insurance marketplace. Our 13 members include the insurance arms of Canada's major banks and credit unions, along with their insurer business partners, which underwrite credit protection insurance and travel insurance. This is the first of 3 webinars we are hosting with regulatory authorities across Canada. Today, we're pleased to have a panel of 3 senior regulators from Canada's 3 largest regulatory authorities. Each of these individuals is very busy, and we are grateful to them for making the time to speak with us today about their views of how the regulatory environment has been and will be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me now introduce our 3 panelists. Frank Chong is Vice President and Deputy Superintendent, Regulation at the British Columbia Financial Services Authority, or BCFSA. The BCFSA is a Crown agency and the regulator responsible for solvency and market conduct regulation of financial institutions, credit unions, P&C and life insurers, captives, and trust companies. Frank is also the current Vice Chair of the Canadian Council of Insurance Regulators, CCIR, and he teaches a course on the business of insurance for the Insurance Institute of Canada. Nathalie Sirois is Senior Director, Supervision of Insurers and Control of Right to Practice at Autorité des marchés, financiers, or the AMF, in Quebec. Nathalie earned a diploma in Business Administration from Laval University in 1989. She also completed an MBA with a specialization in financial services from the University of Quebec at Montreal. She worked for 11 years at a major insurance company and gained significant expertise in insurance matters. When the Autorité des marchés financiers, the AMF, was established in 2004, Ms. Sirois joined the new integrated financial services regulator in Quebec, and since then has continuously increased her staff executive responsibilities. In March 2014, she was appointed Senior Director, Supervision of Insurers and Control of Right to Practice. Huston Loke is Executive Vice President, Market Conduct at the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, or FSRA. Huston is an outcomes-driven financial services senior leader with extensive experience and expertise in regulation, compliance, risk management, and evidence-based policy development. He oversees market and business conduct within the sectors regulated by FSRA, including insurance licensing and market conduct regulation. Huston previously served as Director of the Corporate Finance Branch with the Ontario Securities Commission, where he oversaw securities-related market conduct matters for all Ontario-based public companies and exempt market issuers. Huston holds a Bachelor of Arts in Science and a Master of Business Administration degree, and he is a chartered financial analyst. Now, today's webinar will be recorded and posted on our CAFII website in the near future. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to our presenters during the Q&A session, which we have allotted 20 minutes for at the concluding section of today's webinar, please send them to me as your host using the Q&A function of Zoom, and I will pose them on your behalf. Unless you specifically request that you be identified in your question as its source, I will pose all questions to our panelists on an anonymous basis. Now, before we get the webinar underway, I want to extend a special welcome to a number of VIP guest attendees. In addition to many representatives from our 13 CAFII member companies, we have attendees today from allied industry associations such as the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Association, CLHIA, and the Travel Health Insurance Association, THIA, and from insurance and financial services regulators and policymakers across Canada, including the BC Financial Services Authority, the BC Ministry of Finance, the Insurance Council of BC, the Alberta Insurance Council, Alberta Treasury Board and Finance, Insurance Council of Manitoba, the Saskatchewan Financial and Consumers Affairs Authority, Nova Scotia's Office of the Superintendent of Insurance, the Ontario Ministry of Finance, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, the Autorité des marchés financiers in Quebec, the Canadian Council of Insurance Regulators, or the CCIR, the Canadian Insurance Services Regulatory Organizations, or CISRO, and the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. Welcome to you all. I would now like to begin by asking the first question, and that question is what each of our panelists feels has been the biggest COVID-19 driven surprise to them in their work as an insurance regulator. Frank, let me call upon you first to get the conversation started.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. And I want to thank CAFII and the attendees for the opportunity to speak on this webinar and under such unique circumstances. Let me first say that the biggest surprise, I think, to me as a regulator, and in particular an insurance regulator, was how quickly I think the insurance industry, both life and the P&C sector, and regulators came together to respond to not only the needs of the public, but also the consumers and companies and their employees. We're not completely out of the pandemic yet, but Canada and the broader financial and insurance sector has really performed exceptionally well during this global issue. And credit should really be given to each of you for really contributing to being able to be focused on your customers through this very challenging environment. And in many ways, I think that the financial services sector, and particularly insurance, had become sort of an extension of not only government, but overall society in order to provide relief and support to Canadians and to your customers in particular. I also do need to credit the work by the Canadian Council of Insurance Regulators, who really helped facilitate many of the discussions and decisions with the insurance sector to move the industry forward during such challenging times. And so I do want to maybe perhaps credit those that are joining with me on this panel, both Huston and Nathalie, for their exceptional work through this period as well too. So I do want to maybe perhaps just sum up by basically saying the biggest surprise is really how quickly we came together, not only regulators, but also the industry, to be able to respond to very, very challenging and unique circumstances.
Thank you very much, Frank. And Nathalie, let me ask you for some comments on this issue.
I'm totally in agreement with what Frank has just mentioned. And I would say in complement, what I would say what had surprised me at first, I would say that it happened so rapidly and things have evolved so quickly. Even though we were hearing what was happening elsewhere in the world in other countries, as soon as the first case of COVID-19 happened in Canada and was confirmed, the number of cases started to grow and never stopped to grow for a while. Secondly, I would say that the conjunction of a pandemic with a financial and economic crisis, not only as regulator, we had to make sure that the insurers were up and running, so we're able to maintain their operations. But at the same time, we had to follow, and we were following very closely the stock market, which was going down very rapidly and at a pace we haven't seen at that pace in the past. So we had, to keep the right balance between, we knew that the insurers needed time to maintain their operations, but at the same time, as a prudential regulator, we had to make sure also that the financial and economic crisis would not have a big impact on the solvency and the profitability of the insurers. Another element maybe I wanted to bring is although we were all aware of the interconnection between countries, but in my view, COVID-19 made us realize even more how much this interdependency had a major impact. And I would say finally that as an organization ourselves at the AMF, we had also to activate our own business continuity plan and make sure that we were in position to maintain our operations, to make sure that we were there to support any insurance companies or their industry participant if needed. So it is what I wanted to add, apart from what Frank has mentioned earlier.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. And Huston, let me ask you to close out this part of the conversation.
So with the COVID-19 pandemic, just here's the image I'd like to present to you. When was the last time when everyone was all worried about the same thing? And that's what you had with this pandemic. Everyone was worried about this health crisis that was hitting everyone at exactly the same time. I'll just to inject a little bit of humor into it, what was most surprising was how easy it was to find people, because everyone was at their home, everyone was on their phone, and everyone was at their computer. And so if you needed to get in touch with your partner across the country or your partner across what used to be the hallway at your office, it was very easy. They were all there. I felt that we really recognized the leadership that came through in terms of companies that really put their customer at the center of things. We were making contact with companies saying, have you thought about sort of the customer service side? What are we doing on fulfillment? What are we doing about availability? And it was very clear that there was alignment. There was generally a view that we wanted to serve customers. Regulators, in some cases, had to do some workarounds to make sure that things could transact using new tools and new techniques, such as accepting electronic payments and electronic forms and things like that. And in some ways, it was about just keeping informed and making sure that if there was a regulatory issue on the part of a company, that we could attend to that as soon as possible. So biggest surprise, just being able to get a hold of everyone. But that was all just part of a bigger picture in terms of everyone being aligned in wanting to support the customer.
Thank you, Huston. I'd like to pick up on that theme because it's certainly been something that we've seen in the media, that it would appear Canadians in provinces across the country and federally have increased their trust and faith in government authorities during this period because of the competency of the government reaction at all levels, including regulatory authorities. And it's hard not to contrast that with what we see in our southern neighbor. And so I want to pick up on that theme of how, as regulatory authorities, you've adjusted, and ask you, how difficult has it been for you and your colleagues at your regulatory authorities to continue to work and carry out your critical organization's mandates during this pandemic? Anyone would like to start?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of just the overall impact to our organization at the BC Financial Services Authority, surprisingly, through the past few months, it was not necessarily challenging for us to move to a virtual environment. Our business environment was already well structured and well suited to be able to go into that environment, and many of our staff were already working remotely in a part-time capacity. I think what was more challenging for regulators like BCFSA, and perhaps my colleagues and maybe perhaps speak to it, was really just being able to remain coordinated in a way that we understood as regulators what was necessary to be able to provide relief to multiple sectors. And so when you kind of look at our portfolio with, let's say, BC Financial Services Authority, and I'm pretty sure it's the same with FSRA and the AMF, is that we're handling multiple sectors as well too. And so we needed to ensure that the relief measures that we were applying to one sector was also being treated similarly, or at least applied similarly in other sectors as well too. And so things like forms or reporting. And so in some cases, let's say one sector had approached the regulator and asked for some sort of relief on reporting. Well, we also needed to think similarly with the other sectors and apply that elsewhere. And the same goes to other things like capital and other conduct requirements as an example. At the heart of it, though, our focus, as many of my colleagues may attest to, was really centered around ensuring that customers were being put at the sort of the focal point here. What I will say is that in terms of sort of the ease to moving towards adapting to COVID-19 and the more challenging sort of environment that we were put into was just really streamlining engagement and communication with the industry. And I think most helpful was the Canadian Council of Insurance Regulators, who was able to coordinate on our behalf across Canada and also conduct the appropriate monitoring at that national level. And so in many ways, the industry did benefit from a coordinated mechanism like CCIR. And so that, I think, helped the ease there. The other thing I would also say is that many of us are also members of the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, which is essentially at that international level of regulators. And we also had a line of sight as to what other jurisdictions outside of Canada were up to during this particular time frame, and we did get good line of sight into what was good practice in other jurisdictions where others were perhaps falling short, and so we were able to benchmark ourselves against other jurisdictions internationally.
Thank you. Huston, Nathalie?
On our part, for FSRA, it's been interesting. Whenever something like this happens, necessity is the mother of invention. If you had said to us in early March, we're going to have to move everyone off-site and continue on all their functions with a very minimal physical presence within a few weeks' time, many people would have said, no, we need months to plan. We need to do all these things. And when it's forced upon you, you just find a way to get it done. And I suspect many organizations would have shared our experience in that you put all your work into buckets. There's the bucket of things that is pure throwaway. You've got to do something and it's because of the pandemic and you just have to deal with it in order to allow insurers to access their customers or our customers to be able to get access to essential services. Then more productively, there is the bucket of things where there are certain ways of doing things where you get to now keep that process. And so we've been able to benefit from some of those processes, moving some things digitally, moving some of our interactions digitally, and making sure that we can still keep things going. And I suspect that's also the case for the insurers. A lot of the companies that we talk to tell us that it's been actually interesting. Some customers, are fine with the virtual interaction with their financial services professional and with their agent. So I suspect we've all got different flavors of this, but there are some pieces that are definitely going to stick around after the pandemic.
Thank you, Huston. Nathalie?
Yes, maybe in addition again, and as my other colleagues, we had to adapt our how we approach our supervisory work, and as an organization, most of our employees were already ready to work remotely from home. So it was not a real issue for us. But I would say that we had to adapt how we do our supervisory activities. So of course, we've decided totally that there won't be any on-site supervision. But at the same time that, again, we were very conscious to the fact that the insurers had themselves to adapt to the situation, had many adjustments to put in place. We had to maintain I would say our supervision, just to make sure that any institution would face any difficulty in their financial condition. So at the AMF, of course, and my other colleagues also apply what we call the risk-based supervisory framework. So it was not a real challenge to change our supervisory plan and to change the approach with the insurers. And after 4 months or so, I would say that we increased even the communication with the insurers, but we focus more I would say our work on specific risks that we identify which in relation with the COVID-19 crisis. So this is what I wanted to add.
Thank you, Nathalie. I'm just going to pause for a moment and remind attendees that we do welcome your questions and we will be posing them to the panelists. You can use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask a question by sending it to me, and I'll pose it on your behalf. Nathalie, maybe I'll start with you for the next question, and it picks up on Frank's point that his organization has interacted with the International Association of Insurance Regulators, and I know that the AMF is also very active in that organization and internationally. Could you tell us if you've become aware of any COVID-19 driven international developments in insurance regulation or policy or best practices that you believe could make its way to Canada as a response to the pandemic?
Yes, I would say in my view that one of the best practices that we've seen develop more and more during the crisis, and I think both of my colleagues here have mentioned that, it's the coordination between different regulators, just to make sure that we are treating a similar situation in the same way. Of course, we don't have the same legislative or regulation framework around the world, but of course we've seen what has been done for travel insurance, for example, in other countries, and of course we were making sure that we had that kind of information and see if we can adapt any kind of I would say measures that have been taken by other regulators in other countries, and we could apply it in Canada, in the context of Canada and in Quebec, in our case, at the AMF. So it is one thing. Of course, it's difficult right now to mention how it will impact on a permanent basis our legislative and regulatory or other normative approach, but I would say that we've been more conscious of the other actions taken by other regulators and governments around the world.
Thank you. Huston?
I think I will pick up on the theme of coordination. During a time of crisis, especially a health crisis like this, we have to all think about why are we here? So the reason I think why we're here is because we want to allow people to have fulfilled that promise of security that they purchased in the form of insurance. We want to be able to support them as they access their insurance that they've paid up for. We want to support them as they have, in order to have access to buy new insurance products. All through the pandemic, people continue to have life events, whether it's, having children, getting married, having some other situation in their family, and access is important. How can we as regulators support access to insurance, and how can we as regulators allow insurers to fulfill their commitments to their customers? Well, coordination is one good way. So I head up one of the CCIR committees for COVID-19. I'm joined by my capable colleagues across the country. And we wanted to make ourselves very available to industry associations in particular to provide a harmonized view on things. If there were concerns about whether certain approaches would run afoul of regulations, or if there were questions or any items where we could update each other, we provided a forum for that. And at the same time, that was very valuable for us because as regulators, it's in times of disruption and change where we actually need the information. Our stakeholders may be telling us that there are certain issues in regards to access, certain issues in regards to potential fair treatment and conduct concerns. And this allowed us to be coordinated nationally and to be able to share information with each other. And the industry was very helpful in terms of also supplying us with the information we needed at the time.
Thank you, Huston. And Frank, let me ask you for a last word on this particular topic.
Sure, I won't go too much further than what my colleagues have discussed, but I will maybe perhaps just leave one particular point, and that is at the international level, when you're looking at sort of the developments as a result of COVID-19, I can't think of any time where, you know, at an international level that COVID-19 has influenced, or any particular issue, global issue has influenced not only commercial lines, but also personal lines, the life sector, as well as the P&C sector. And so I think that as regulators and as industry participants, we're going to have to look at more deeply into products, in particular, various significant products that are made available to the marketplace, like business interruption insurance, like certain liability insurance, like catastrophe insurance, to look at things like how those are defined. We're going to have to look at how those products are structured, some elements around sort of disclosure. But, you know, regulators, obviously, in discussions with government policymakers and industry participants, we're going to have to sort of revisit some of that, because I think that COVID-19 has changed a lot of what sort of consumers view, let's say, business interruption, despite the fact that many exclusions exist previously. And so I think there was some views by the public that it would cover. But I think that as we come out of COVID-19, I think we're going to have to talk about, you know, sort of that gap between the public and consumer expectations and what industry offers through their products and services.
Thank you for that, Frank. And I'd like to pick up on this theme. And maybe I'll start it off with you, Huston, and just delve into it in a little bit more detail. What I'd like to ask is, do you see some ongoing trends when this pandemic is hopefully soon behind us, and perhaps not soon? That's clearly one of the things that no one knows. I'm thinking of a couple of areas. I mean, you mentioned coordination, harmonization, something industry pre-pandemic always emphasized as a core priority for the insurance marketplace. Do you expect that might become a higher priority on an ongoing basis for provincial regulators across Canada? And then on digitization, certainly in terms of our internal discussion, we've seen a turbo change in terms of an existing trend that accelerated greatly. And you know, that has been principally around interaction with customers, but you've all touched upon how it's also included the interaction between regulators and their regulated entities. And so on digitization and harmonization, I'm wondering if I could ask the three of you to comment on what you think might stay post-pandemic and be sort of an enduring new reality. Huston, could I start with you on that?
Sure. I think on harmonization, it's always a lost opportunity if we don't do our best to arrive at answers that are largely similar, so that the companies that are in the business can actually serve their customers in an effective way, in a way where cost is reasonable, and in a way where there is coordination across the country. So we will always try to do that. I think the pandemic has highlighted the value that can be attained when those efforts are made. I also believe that there was a commitment to that previously. So that is one of the things that I think will continue, but I'd like to think that that regulators across the country were committed to that even before the pandemic. On the digital side of things, here's where things get very interesting. I think that at the very onset, we were all in one way or another scrambling, sending around, what's your mobile number? What's the best way to reach you? What are the, how do we set up is it a Zoom call or a Microsoft Teams issue? All these small things were logistical challenges, but everyone managed. And I imagine when it came to customer interactions, a lot of insurance, when it's sold to the end customer, it did involve a lot of personal contact. There were underwriting included medical aspects and things like that. And that all had to move to adapt. I think the piece that can't be ignored is digital security, as well as the potential to create secure spaces for insurance companies and their end customers to exchange information. And wow, what an incredible way for the industry to modernize distribution. You have something that's foisted upon you that no one would have wished for, that has caused untold damage to health and welfare of people across the world. But at the same time, now you are forcing everyone to work digitally, perhaps answer the same questions digitally, perhaps have that captured and processed digitally, and in a way that can actually, over the long term, potentially enhance the ability for insurers to determine if a product is right for a customer. It can enhance the record keeping. It can keep records more secure. It can make compliance more manageable. That offers tremendous potential, and we are really looking forward to working with insurers, and having discussions with MGAs and agents about what is the best way that these tools that have been developed or that are being developed can be used to really further the outcomes that we all want, which is the right product in the hands of the customer.
Thank you, Huston. Nathalie, can I ask you to pick up on that theme and offer your thoughts?
Sorry, I was on mute mode. Of course, and I was to say the same thing as Huston mentioned. I think the way insurers distribute and offer their products will probably change in the future. There will be less, I would say, in-person contact, and there will be an opportunity, as Huston mentioned, for insurers to, I would say, change the way they interact with their customers. Of course, it doesn't mean that there's still a need for I would say, to protect the information that is exchanged between the insurer and the consumer. So it will become very important to develop very secure space to exchange that kind of information. The other thing is if people use more digitally, I would say, a mode of distribution, it will be important for insurers to have communications that are clear. So maybe have less a product complex, have more clear information to provide to the consumer, since they maybe those consumers won't have access to their agents or to have access to a person to explain in more detail the signification of some provisions in their contracts or in the material provided by the insurers. The other thing I see as an opportunity with the COVID-19 is, and I think that Frank mentioned it earlier about the product. I think with this crisis, we realize, everyone, that for some products, it is not clear what is the role of one party. And I have in mind, of course, the example of travel insurance, where there was many articles in the newspapers about the fact that the airlines companies had a role to play to compensate the consumer, and also the insurers had a role to play, since they offer some travel insurance cancellation protection. So I think it will be a good opportunity maybe for the insurance industry not only coordinate their activities between themselves and insurance industry participants, but to see how they could coordinate their actions with other counterparties that have also a role to play in some kind of protection.
Thank you. And Frank, last comment to you.
Yeah, sure, thanks. And maybe perhaps what I'll do is just sort of say that I think the industry has always been very much supportive of greater harmonization amongst at that sort of provincial level, and also a huge champion around supporting digitization and modernizing financial services. CAFII and other industry associations have come to not only CCIR and other organizations like BCFSA to talk about the need for harmonization, digitization, modernization. What COVID-19 actually did was highlight, I guess, the gaps between a lot of the archaic requirements, maybe perhaps rooted in the provincial insurance acts or regulatory requirements that are disconnected from sort of the business of insurance. And so I think at some point after all of this, I think what we will need to do is do a bit of a reconciling of what did not necessarily serve in the public interest at the end of the day. And so I'll take, for example, a very simplistic example around notification requirements being through registered mail. Well, in this particular environment, does that necessarily make the most sense, as an example? So those types of small little things that we can do to be able to help modernize, I think, the insurance sector, I think, will be very, very helpful in propelling us into maybe perhaps a new way of how we conduct business sort of moving forward, whether or not that be distribution, whether or not that be, other particular ways of undertaking insurance business. I think that we will probably benefit out of this particular difficult situation.
Maybe I'm going to pick up on that and ask a question from one of the attendees, because it directly relates to this matter. And I think it connects to something Nathalie said, which is, you've all mentioned how quickly industry and the regulatory authorities have responded to the new realities and adjusted. But Nathalie mentioned that the legislative framework remains the same, because that, in all the provinces, can't change very quickly. I know it's perhaps a challenging question for you to answer, but what the question the attendee wanted to pose is, what do you see happening in terms of legislative changes over time to allow the framework under which you operate to respond to some of these new realities? Frank, maybe I'll start with you, since you were commenting on this.
Yeah, I think first off, I think that once we are out of the pandemic, I think it is worthwhile for not only the industry, but also regulators to sort of sit down and talk about what were some of the lessons learned out of the pandemic. And I think it's very important that we take stock of all the different things that we had not only discussed, whether or not that's at CCIR or individual regulators, and have that conversation with the policymakers, because I think that the attendee is correct to point out that the overarching legislative sort of framework that we're sort of all operating under does need to get modernized, and we do need to look at how we can do that from the lens of still being able to meet the public interest. Because I think at the end of the day, what we have seen, I think in an extraordinary manner, was that the industry was able to still meet the public interest in many ways, but doing it in a different manner than maybe perhaps under the old constructs of many of the provincial insurance acts. And so I think that and there's also some things that we may want to sort of reevaluate and discuss as to whether or not they still are relevant today. But I think that taking stock at the very end, once we're out of this, I think is an important sort of first step as part of that sort of journey towards modernization.
Thank you, Frank. Nathalie, can I ask you to join in on this?
I don't have many things to add to what Frank has just mentioned. I'm totally in agreement about what he was saying about the fact that once we're out of this crisis, we will need to sit all together and see what are the lessons learned from that crisis, what went well, what went less well, and if there's any for improvements in our framework, legislative or regulation. I think it will be a good opportunity even for regulators and our governments to sit down together, and other parties that maybe had a role in this crisis sit together and see how we can in the future be better, even better. Hope that that kind of crisis won't happen every year though, but just to make sure that we will be in better position to be proactive and less reactive.
Thank you. Huston?
Just what I'd add is some of these things are not necessarily legislative in terms of things you take away post-pandemic. And I'll give you an example. We always talk about fair treatment because that's the principle that all their work hinges upon. Sometimes fair treatment is much less complicated than we make it out to be. It starts with fulfilling the promise to the customer. What did the customer think they purchased, and what ends up happening when they need insurance? You know, when you think of what just happened to us, this was a period where there was no question of the value of insurance. The value of coverage over the last number of months has been made plain and clear. If you had the right coverage, you could be taken care of. And I think one thing that we'll take away is a practice that we've seen from some companies and industry associations to publish their position on things in real time. So not waiting for 6 months and then coming out with an extra 30 pages that they add on to their policy, but actually to issue a press release and to guide people and say, here is what we are going to cover, and here are the processes that you follow, and here is what we're going to be excluding. Because in a time of crisis, in a time of need, that's fair treatment, to know what you're up against or to know what you're covered for.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Huston. I have a question from an attendee. It's a two-part question. It starts with what changes you've observed as regulators to consumer behavior as a result of COVID. And it mentions, for example, perhaps increased complaints or heightened level of concerns and additional risks such as fraud. And so the question is whether you've seen any shifts from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic in those areas. And then the second part of the question is what you've done differently to educate consumers or provide them with tools during the pandemic. And Huston, maybe I'll start with you on this one.
I'll start with the second part of the question on what we're doing to educate or what we think we need to do going forward. FSRA has started an Office of the Consumer set of positions, and what the Office of the Consumer will be doing is reaching out to consumers both in terms of advisory panel discussions as well as materials that will help them make the best choices for them and to think about the customer experience. So I think that's so important. Insurance is complicated. It doesn't, it contains conditions that can make it difficult to access. And I think regulators need to bridge that, or we need to be part of the discussion. Of course, insurers and agents have a huge role to play as well. But I think that's an area that we've felt to be quite important. And so we've been staffing up in that regard, and we're working on materials that should help customers make sure that they understand the products that they're accessing.
Nathalie?
Yes, on the first part of the question, of course, we've seen, I would say that we haven't seen a significant increase in the formal complaints, but we've seen an increase in the request for information to our information center. Of course, some people were in some distress situation, and one of the organization they may want to contact was their regulator with regard to their investment products, insurance products, etc. We've issued a lot of press releases or notices in our website at the AMF to make sure that the consumer were well informed, and also the industry. And we had, I would say, expectations from the insurance industry that themselves, they will communicate on a proper, in a timely manner with their consumer to inform them about their different initiatives. I would say that the insurance industry has been very proactive and in offering, because they knew they wanted to support their customers, offering rebates, payment delays, etc. But I have to say that the measures were not applied on the same way from insurer to insurer. Of course, every insurer had to adapt their own measures according to their own situation. But I would say that if there's something that can be improved in the future is that, and I think it meets the comment from Huston where the fair treatment of customer is very important. So instead of expecting the consumer to do something to have access to a rebate or a measures, the insurer should be more proactive in contacting itself, the consumer, and offering those kind of relief measures.
Thank you, Nathalie. And Frank, did you want to comment on this?
Sure. Rather than maybe perhaps highlighting sort of the gap, I do want to maybe perhaps just provide a different perspective, and that is, what I think has been particularly good from the insurance sector, and I will maybe perhaps highlight a particular part of the sector with regards to the travel insurance side of things. And I think that those that were offering travel insurance during this particular period, I think generally have done a pretty solid job when it comes to being responsive to their policyholders, their consumers, travelers, and being very clear with the communication. And also in some ways, and there were many examples where not only were they being fair to those consumers, but in some cases I saw insurers going well beyond what perhaps they were being allowed for under their existing policies. And so I think that there are great examples by the insurers through this particular period that just sort of highlight, I guess, that change in overall behavior and recognizing that I think that insurers can do more. And I think that those types of solid behaviors that we saw from, let's say, the travel insurers, as an example, through this particular period of time, can be propelled forward and perhaps show as an example, I think, for other participants well past this pandemic.
Thank you, Frank. And this is a perfect segue into a question from one of the attendees. And as both you and Nathalie mentioned specifically travel insurance, which is the topic of this question, I'll start with you, Nathalie. And it's an area of some controversy. The attendee asks why, and in fact, I'll start with a preamble first. The attendee notes that some jurisdictions have mandated that travel companies provide customers with refunds for cancellations, but Canada has not. And in fact, the attendee mentioned some people in Canada have called for travel insurers to pay out for canceled travel company contracts by paying claims for canceled travel arrangements where the airline or the provider only provided credits. So the question is, do you believe travel companies have the right to retain funds where no service has been provided? And why should travel insurers have to reimburse customers where the travel companies have not refunded the service that was not provided? So Nathalie, I'll put you on the hot seat on that one to start.
Yeah, that's a complex question. And this is something we're still, I would say, discussing between regulators and their governments, and between regulators and the industry. I don't have a formal answer to give to you, unfortunately, about that. Of course, there's great expectation from the insurance industry about their capacity to reimburse the consumer. I would say, in my view, that the negative aspect, maybe I don't have the right terminology or the right term to provide to you, but it's the fact that it's not a good thing that the consumer had, to see one participant, let's say airlines company, to obtain some reimbursement. And then if you're not able to have reimbursement, have to go to see another participant to see if he can have access to a kind of reimbursement. So, and it's why I was mentioning earlier during one of the answer I provided that there will be in the future a need to maybe coordinate more since some players have a role to play for a similar, not similar coverage, but one party has an impact on another. So there will be a need for more coordination, and not only within the insurance industry participants, but there will be a need to consider other participants. Of course, it happened again very rapidly, so no one could in an instant travel around the world. So it stopped very abruptly, and probably at the time we didn't have time to think about those interactions and interdependency. But there will be a need in the future to analyze more deeply that situation and see how we won't face again. And not only for travel insurance, maybe they could have other examples that could affect other P&C industry. For example, business interruption was a good example from Frank, where there will be a need to coordinate more about from government with the industry, etc.
Thank you, Nathalie. Frank, can you jump in on this issue of travel vouchers, travel credits?
Yeah, I mean, I think, from our perspective, I mean, that is certainly going to be a decision made company by company. But I will say this, maybe perhaps at a broader level around fair treatment. I think that one thing that we will recognize through sort of the pandemic here is that fair treatment is not just simply a regulatory concept, it's also a business concept as well too, because I think out of this pandemic, those consumers that were perhaps viewed as maybe perhaps not receiving that sort of treatment, the fair treatment from their insurance company, will remember it. And consumers, we know, have very long memories. And so I think that what we perhaps may want to sort of think about is sort of not necessarily looking at it with regards to the paradigm of fair treatment from being a regulatory concept, but moving it to more of a business concept, recognizing that, companies and their reputations and how they will be perceived by their consumers and potential customers moving forward will be impacted. And so I think that those companies that have been able to go beyond, and we've seen good examples of that, where they have gone beyond what they've agreed to, I think have received positive reputation and positive uplift in terms of their business with consumers. And so I think that I think that obviously with regards to travel insurance, that's one example. But as Nathalie points out, there are other product examples like business interruption insurance, liability insurance, other life products as well too. And so thinking about it not only from the regulatory concept moving to a business concept with fair treatment is going to be important well past this pandemic.
Thank you, Frank. Huston, last word on this issue to you.
I think to Frank's point, customer expectations have, I think, been higher. And I think industry recognizes that no one can be seen as being the recipient, unwitting or otherwise, of a huge benefit because of the pandemic. So if there were services that just could not be accessed, then what we saw was a fairly consistent pattern. And I do want to recognize the leadership of the companies that had perhaps more generous interpretations on some of the policy language, and were able to provide some relief. Were able to extend some payment terms in certain cases, and provide some relief where hardship considerations should have been taken into account for their customers. I think those are important considerations. And as Frank said, which I completely agree with, fair treatment has perhaps expanded, and it's not just this regulatory concept buried in a principle. It is something that customers do expect, and I do want to recognize the leadership that was shown by some of the companies that really did their best to provide that to customers.
Thank you, Huston. We're coming right to the end of our allotted hour. The hour has really gone by very quickly. You've been a wonderful panel, have been very insightful. So thank you to all three of you. I'm going to end by asking you for your final thoughts and perhaps words of wisdom to those on the call. And I'm going to go in reverse order from how I started. So I'll start with you, Huston, then you, Nathalie, and we'll put the last word for you, Frank. So Huston, your final thoughts, please.
I think that I mentioned earlier that I asked the question, why are we here? It's really to have customers, to give customers access to insurance and security that they've purchased. And I remind my staff of that. That's why the regulatory environment is always evolving and adapting, because products are changing and because expectations are shifting. So as we move to the next leg and the plan for somewhat of a return to normal, we should remember the period when people were really reminded of how important insurance was, and be reminded that the customer expectations for fair treatment have never been higher. So we need to work towards that as regulatory bodies together with industry. Thank you,
Huston. Nathalie?
Yes, just maybe to add to what Huston mentioned is that, of course, we're still focusing right now to make sure that we won't face a second waves, or at least to mitigate the risk or the impact of a second waves on the financial stability, on population, of course. But once I would say that things will be more stable, there will be a need to sit together to learn from what had happened and see how we can improve ourselves as organization, as regulators. But one thing is pretty sure that we have adapted some processes internally, and that will probably stay like it is right now. And so I don't think we will come back as it was 4 months ago. Some things will change permanently. And for example, work remotely at home, I don't think that in the future, organizations will again have 100 of their people working in the same building. It is my view, at least. So I think some things will change permanently. So we'll see how the other things will evolve as well.
Thank you, Nathalie. And Frank, over to you for the last word.
Sure, thanks a lot, and I'll keep my final remarks short. Certainly, I want to just want to say that that each and every one of you should be proud of your working contributions to contributing to the stability of Canada's financial and more specifically the insurance sector. And Canadians can certainly have confidence in the insurance sector because of the responsiveness of the industry and industry participants like yourselves. Insurance companies have always been on the forefront of responding to crises at both a regional, national, or even an international level. And so for that, your preparedness for any particular issue, I think, is vital to the economic recovery of both Canada and globally as well, too. And so you have, I think, continued to show that you can adapt and encourage it's certainly those participants to sort of reevaluate their performance through this pandemic. And once everything is said and done, to consider and take stock of all the lessons learned through this particular period. And so we do know that certainly that this is not Canada's last emergency, and that we will have future emergencies. And I think that taking stock and learning the lessons this time around will prepare us for that next emergency. Do want to extend my thanks to CAFII, and we do want to appreciate all the members and the attendees on the line today. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you for that, Frank. And before I end this webinar, I just would ask attendees to mark the date. Tuesday, August 25th from 12 to 1 p.m. We'll have the second in the series of regulatory webinars in a discussion with senior Atlantic Canada insurance regulators and policymakers. Frank, Huston, Nathalie, you've been just wonderful panelists. I can't thank you enough on behalf of attendees for joining us today and for your insights and knowledge. Much appreciated. To attendees, thank you for attending as well. This webinar is now concluded, and I wish everybody a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.